This is 8-Minute Climate Fix, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. So I've talked on this show before about the challenges we're facing in trying to decarbonize the space heating in our buildings. And while individual buildings can transition to electric heat pumps, it's a lot more complicated at a macro level. We have an entire gas distribution industry with millions of miles of embedded infrastructure that needs to come along for the ride somehow. And it's not just a matter of letting the shift towards heat pumps just happen naturally. If everyone installed new equipment tomorrow, maybe there's an argument to shut down a pipeline or distribution network, but not everyone installs on the same timeline. What happens to those who take a bit longer to transition off of gas? Are they now bearing the cost of operating and maintaining a piping network originally designed for millions of homes? For a brief moment, it looked like gas distribution companies could maybe burn a different type of fuel, say hydrogen or renewable natural gas, but the inefficiencies of those fuels are making them a non-starter. So then, what's next? How should we be thinking about a just, equitable transition from gas to electric, one that brings along all consumers and supports the local gas distribution companies as well? To start to think about this question, I'm joined by one of the premier voices in this area, Jan Rosenow. Jan is the Vice President and European Program Director at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'm excited to dive into this topic with him. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's race it, or about the amount of time you have left until the holidays are upon us. Okay, I'm kidding, a little, but we all know these last few weeks are going to fly by. Let's get it on. Jan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me. I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating conversation.
I cannot wait to dive into it. But before we actually get into the topic of the day, let's learn a little bit more about Jan and your role over at Regulatory Assistance Project.
Yeah, so I've worked in energy for 2 decades now, maybe a little bit more, covering very much all aspects of energy, but with a focus on energy demand through most of my career. And at RAP, we focus on advising policymakers, regulators, other organizations on clean energy policy and regulation. Really, our main aim is to improve the policy and regulatory framework so we can allow technologies that provide energy that's clean and more efficient to the world, and do so in a way that hopefully is also very cost effective and is fair. So it's very strongly focused on policy and regulation. And I know today we're going to talk more about gas in particular, but we also cover things like power market design or how to regulate buildings or industry, transportation. That's us. I'm based in Oxford, UK, but we work all over the world in most of the biggest energy markets.
Well, I think it's a great topic for us to talk about. Let's start then with kind of a foundational overview as to where the gas distribution network is today. What's the state of the current industry? What are we talking about when we talk about the gas distribution industry?
Yeah, I mean, I could give you numbers to put it into perspective, which would help, I think. So in Europe, we have 130,000 kilometers of gas transmission pipelines. You can do the maths. That's about 3 times, maybe a little bit more, of the circumference of the Earth. And we have around 1.8 million kilometers of distribution pipeline infrastructure. That's almost 50 times the circumference of the Earth. So a vast infrastructure that has been built over the last few decades. And gas is pretty much everywhere, right? We use it for electricity generation. We use it for heating. We use it in industry for a lot of applications. And it's been a relatively cheap commodity until recently. We've been able to import it from places that we don't longer want to import it from, but it's been very abundant, and we're now in a situation where some questions arise. Do we still want to continue on that pathway, or is it time for a reset? But it's an extremely vast infrastructure has been built over decades with a lot of money invested in it. And of course, there's a lot at stake for the industry that's running those assets.
Yeah, it's an industry and a infrastructure that's been built, as you said, over decades, but it needs to transition very, very quickly as well. What Give us some perspective in terms of what that timeline looks like in order to meet our decarbonization goals to the Paris Agreement. What do we need to do with the gas distribution industry?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course there's a bunch of different scenarios that give you some insight into that, and I mean, one of the scenarios, this is at European level again, that I could refer to is the latest impact assessment of the European Commission when they kind of looked at how are we going to meet our 2040 90% greenhouse gas reduction goal or 2050 climate neutrality goal. And what that impact assessment says is that fuels that are gases, so that's not just a natural gas, I call it fossil gas, but it's also some of the alternative gases such as hydrogen or bioenergy, biomethane. If you add all that together, we would see a more than 70% reduction in gaseous fuel use by 2050. So that is, of course, a very steep decline. Yeah. And we're going to see the same at global level. So another way to look at it would be the International Energy Agency's 2050 net zero energy roadmap. We see the same sorts of trends, very significant reduction in overall gas use. And that has huge implications for the infrastructure that we currently use, because if you if you use 70% less of the commodity that you're transporting, well, that has some significant implications for how viable that technology still is. And also, some of the gases will be very different, right? Hydrogen is fundamentally a very different gas, has different characteristics. But also on the demand side, I mean, we really should no longer install any more heating systems that burn gas, because they are more viable alternatives. In industry, when new factories are being built, we should not really put in new gas boilers. We should do as much as we can with electricity, because that's the key lever. So big implications for meeting those climate goals. And when you think it through, it really means a very dramatic change for the gas distribution and transmission industry as we know it.
So you laid out two specific challenges for the gas distribution industry there, one of which is what to do with the existing infrastructure. And the second is going forward, what do they do? Here in Massachusetts, last year, the state and the Commonwealth decided to enforce the fact that any new pipelines that were going to be built, they were not going to necessarily provide any sort of regulatory assistance or rate making against hydrogen or renewable natural gas. You had to install electrified solutions for your space heating or industrial applications. Actually, I take that back. I'm not certain about the industrial applications, but definitely for the space heating. It feels like there are two different challenges, one of which is the current infrastructure and one of which is the growth going forward. How is the gas distribution industry thinking about their business model in this new decarbonized economy?
Well, it's interesting. It really varies by country. And what we find is we just actually got a report out last week on the issue of gas grid regulation in Europe and in the context of net zero climate goals. And what we find is that there are huge discrepancies between countries. So in some countries, the gas grid operators actually assume almost like no change in demand, right? They assume that there's going to be the similar demand for decades to come, and the gas grid will be sort of operating in infinity. And in other places, their predictions are much closer aligned with some of the climate modeling that's been done and what that requires. Interesting also how regulators then design regulation, right? And that's the point you were making. Do they allow investment in new gas infrastructure, for example? Do they require certain criteria to be met before you can socialize those costs across a customer base? And again, there are huge differences. And this is really important because these assets have very long lifetimes. I mean, just to maybe give you some numbers here, typically for a new gas distribution or transmission pipeline system, you could have 80 years of lifetime, right? And if you then work back from 2050, which is when most of the world has agreed now to decarbonize, actually the numbers just don't add up. You might be ended up with stranded assets that still have lots of lifetime in them and haven't been depreciated. So you're stuck with those assets and need to find a way of paying back those people who invested in them, which is basically the consumers who have paid for all of this at some point. So regulation needs to be adapted to recognize that and avoid that we, in my view, lock in new infrastructure with long lifetimes that may no longer be needed because of these really quite steep trajectories in terms of falling gas demand.
Yeah, so I want to touch on some of those regulatory structures and see if you have some ideas and some solutions around that. But I want to really dive into that point about stranded assets and, more importantly, about consumers, who electrify today and other consumers who are electrifying tomorrow. There's probably a more elegant way of saying that, but I'm hoping that the audience can follow along with my thought process here, because as individual households and buildings go ahead and electrify today, and that socialization of the existing infrastructure costs are being spread across a smaller and smaller consumer contingent, that implies a greater cost to deliver the gas to those remaining customers. And most likely, and Jan, this is where I'd love your take on this. Those remaining customers are going to be low and moderate income customers who haven't necessarily provided the capital to transition to a heat pump or ahead of time. And so we're getting into a very tricky situation here about where and how we should be thinking about those costs. How are you thinking about that transition and that messy timing of the transition?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the key challenges. There's no doubt. And again, we have numbers that give us an indication how much the cost could rise if we did nothing. If you just follow the decarbonization pathways that models suggest, we might end up paying 5, maybe 10 times more per unit of energy in terms of grid fees, grid costs. And it's also correct that often it's wealthier customers who switch first, who electrify, switch away from the gas grid, and especially people on lower incomes who might be tenants, who might not actually have any means of deciding about their heating system because they don't own the building, right? They're just renting it. They might be the last ones on the gas grid. And in a worst outcome, they would then be faced with those horrific increases in fees, which, of course, from an energy justice perspective, an equity perspective, is completely incompatible. How can that be addressed? I mean, one of the things that we at RAP have said for a long time is that you should actually prioritize lower income customers first. You should not just offer lots of subsidy and be happy with wealthy people creaming off the subsidy and building in some heat pumps and electrifying the heating and switching away from the gas grid. You should actually have programs that are deliberately designed and are accessible to low-income groups, people who might not be the front runners when it comes to technology adoption, and that's really important. You can also build in some safety valves, and let me explain what I mean by that. So, for example, you can depreciate assets earlier. At the moment, when a lot of people are still connected to the gas grid, even if you just change the gas grid fees a little bit, have a little adder, you can accelerate depreciation of existing assets much more quickly, which then in later years, when you have a smaller number of customers on the grid, they become less of a problem because they have been paid off early. And that's happening now in countries like the Netherlands, for example, or in Denmark. Germany has just started to adopt that policy too. So that's accelerated depreciation of assets. That's another way of making sure that customers who switch last are not faced with a significant cost burden. And then maybe finally, if I may, there's also cost to decommissioning. So in some areas where there's simply no more any significant gas use, we will have to decommission the gas grid, right? And that's a distribution grid primarily. And in order to do that, there needs to be some sort of fund available to pay for that, because there is a cost to decommissioning to make the gas grid safe. That's still there. And that should be paid for, again, in the earlier years, rather than the last customers on the gas grid being faced with that cost of decommissioning. So there are different ways, and I think I just described 3. There are more than 3, but those are the 3 ones I think I wanted to highlight. Just going to summarize again so you can put the those customers first who are maybe most exposed, low income customers, rather than treat them at last in terms of prioritizing electrification, then making sure we accelerate depreciation of assets, and then building a fund for decommissioning early on.
I like that. I think here in the U.S. at least, one of the I don't know if it's controversial, but one of the pushbacks upon the Inflation Reduction Act was really the emphasis upon low and moderate income financing and capitalization of some of the different energy transition solutions and flowing money towards that particular segment, depending upon what side of the aisle you sit upon here in the U.S. And we've got a big election. We're actually recording this on November 4th, so we've got a pretty substantial election coming up tomorrow. That there's been a little bit of pushback around this focus on LMI, but I think you really outlined and articulated why it's so important for bringing along that segment of consumers in a way that makes certain that these costs are not inequitably distributed as we start to decommission some of these large structures. What I'd love to do is dig a little bit more into the other two aspects that you talked about. One of which is depreciation. And again, here in the US, we have something called Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System, which is MACRS, which is typically used for renewable energy projects and those types of things to draw down the financial depreciation of an asset. So for anybody who's not an accountant out there, every big project that you have that you're going to invest millions of dollars into is going to have some sort of lifespan associated with how long it can operate. And to your point, a gas distribution network can operate for 80 plus years, but the financial life of that asset could be 30 years, right? And what you have to do is you take that say it's a $12 million project, you take that $12 million and you depreciate it over 30 years. What you're suggesting is shrinking that time frame and depreciating that asset over a shorter amount of time. Give us some perspective as to how that's going to help the cost burden for those lagging consumers as they electrify.
Yeah, so let's say you have a regulatory framework where you do not have accelerated depreciation, and we build a new gas pipeline today at significant cost. We assume in the regulatory framework that we will depreciate that asset over a lifetime of 80 years. And we suddenly hit 2050, and at that point, it's decided, we're no longer going to use that gas pipeline because we no longer need it because we stopped using gas. There's still, you might have paid off 25 years over 25 years the investment cost of that gas. There's still a lot left, right? There's still another 55 years left to pay off if it has an 80-year lifetime. And then if you might have to pay that off in just the final year in 2050. So the last customers that are still connected to it will have to pay for all of that.
That's a big bill.
That's a very big bill, and that's why in the UK it's now policy. The regulator decided that for all new investments in new infrastructure, they have to be fully depreciated by 2050. So they are compatible with the with the statutory goal for decarbonization for net zero that the UK government adopted. So it's fully in line. And there's other countries, I mentioned the Netherlands earlier, Germany, Denmark, that are moving in that direction. Also, Belgium have elements of that. So we're seeing movement, and regulators realize that this is a huge risk for consumers. And one of the primary duties of regulators, of course, is to keep costs down and protect consumers from heavy cost burdens. And this is just one of the ways of how to manage that. So it's really a way to make sure we're not left with a big bill that is going to be paid by a shrinking number of people, very late in the day. So it's protecting consumers from being exposed to that. So I think it's super important. And it actually, the earlier we start, the better, right? Because if you leave it for too long, then those remaining costs will be squeezed into a shrinking number of years and also a smaller customer base. If you start early, you have more time to stretch out those costs over more years and more customers, and that makes it a lot easier to do.
That was going to be my question, is the fact that as a project, a project that's going to be proposed today for 2024 to 2050, you've got 26 years or so to try to figure out the depreciation. And it looks, similar to a 30-year depreciation cycle that you normally have on a hard asset. Something that's going to be proposed in 2044 with only 6 years left, with a smaller consumer base and everything, the economics around that are going to drive a different decision as to how they're going to proceed, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And there's also now discussion about applying the same rules to existing assets. So you can go back and look at, okay, how long will it take for these assets to be fully depreciated, and you can shorten those periods and bring forward some of that depreciation also for existing assets. So again, regulators are starting to look into that. And so it's not just about new infrastructure; it's also about existing infrastructure.
I like that. And then once those assets have been depreciated, that's where your decommissioning fund comes in terms of how do you start to think about what you're going to do to actually decommission and turn these things off. Talk to us a little bit more about how that's been used in other countries and what some of the lessons learned have been upon some of these decommissioning funds.
I mean, this is early. It's early days. We don't really have lots of countries that have adopted decommissioning funds yet. But in the Netherlands and Denmark, money is being set aside for that. There's also, I think that's also important, disconnection from the gas grid. It traditionally is often coming at a cost to the consumer, right? So if you want to disconnect from the gas grid and decommission your gas connection, you would have to pay for it. In some cases, quite high fees, which is a disincentive to electrify. And that has changed as well. So we're now seeing more and more countries where these costs are being covered by the tariffs, essentially. Yeah? So if you disconnect from the gas grid, any costs with making your gas connection safe after you disconnect from the gas grid, there's a small cost of making it safe, capping your gas pipe and things like that, is not put on the customer making the switch. It's actually paid for by all customers and socialized, just as any other cost would be socialized and paid for by all other customers in the gas network system. So it's early days for these decommissioning funds, but the costs are not insignificant. Yeah, we have some estimates. UK is a good example. I think the decommissioning costs for the UK gas grid will be billions. That's what's been estimated previously, and those costs will need to be set aside if we don't want to run into a situation where we suddenly ask the last remaining customers on the grid to pay for that.
Both of those, all three of those solutions that you kind of outlined very much sit at kind of a national level. I'm almost scared to ask because I'm not certain how far RAP goes down into the local and those types of regulatory situations. But as you start to get into smaller policy making, are there things that local towns or communities or states should be thinking about in terms of supporting this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an interesting and really important part of, I think, of the actual process that you then deploy to go about identifying which areas you might want to look at decommissioning first. So heating and cooling plans play a major role here in Europe, where local authorities are being asked to develop those plans. In Germany, it's now mandatory. In the Netherlands as well, where local towns have to develop a clear trajectory. What does it look like in our area? So in a specific neighborhood, what is the long-term trajectory in terms of technologies that we're going to see there? Might it be communal heating? We have a lot of district heating still in Europe. There's not a lot of that in the US. There's some, but this plays a major role. Or will it be individual heat pumps that will replace gas heating? Or maybe there will be use of biomethane even in some areas. But what is it going to be? So some sort of plan that lays that out, and then alongside that, there will be planning regulations. Really going into the very granular street by street sort of level. And that's starting to happen now in Europe. So it's heat planning will play a major role there, and that is where local governments are getting involved in this transition, and that's a very important step.
I don't know a lot of that happening over here in the US, but I'll put it out to the audience that if anybody knows of local heat planning that's occurring here in the States, please reach out and let me know. Jan, aside from the things that policy and regulators can do positively to affect the transition, are there certain policies that have been put in place that are somehow inadvertently hampering the shift over to cleaner energy?
Well, I mean, there's so many. Where do I start? I mean, I mentioned the having a disconnection fee clearly is it's a disincentive to disconnect from the gas grid, right? So that's one. The other one is, and this is a real issue in a lot of countries that used a lot of gas, or still use a lot of gas for especially for heating, is how we tax energy and also how we allocate policy costs. So let me just put a bit more detail on that. So a lot of the times we see that there's an emissions trading system and a carbon price for electricity, but not for any of the other fuels. So you're essentially making electricity more expensive, but there's not an equivalent for gas prices. And also a lot of the policy costs. So those might be things like renewable energy programs, energy efficiency programs. And this is also true in the US. They tend to be more heavily loaded onto electricity bills. I know in the US, for example, the efficiency targets for electricity have always been higher historically than for gas. So the cost involved and the cost put onto electricity bills versus gas bills are not in sync as a result of that. That's one of the key obstacles for people who might want to switch and consider electrification. But there's this added policy cost and the carbon price they then suddenly face if they electrify. So that's the rebalancing of taxes and levies. That is one of the key themes in my view, and the view of many others, that needs to be addressed. It's a big hurdle and it needs to be overcome. And then there's an awful lot, of other things that are standing in the way of the transition away from using gas. Some of which have to do with planning regulations. Where can you actually put a heat pump? There might be noise constraints, and which, by the way, gas furnaces, gas boilers, as we call them in Europe, do not face in the same way. There might be other constraints around where do you actually aesthetically allow to put an air source heat pump, for example. So these sorts of things can get in the way or certainly slow down the uptake of electrification.
I thought your point about the fact that the electricity bill, is burdened by some of these energy efficiency measures and some of these different things is a fascinating one. I haven't actually thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. We're incentivizing things other than shifting over to electricity in that case, and we need to be thinking about that broadly speaking. Let's shift the conversation a little bit. Let's talk about it from an individual homeowner perspective or an individual building owner perspective, and thinking about the things that they should be thinking about as the gas distribution network changes. What are some of the things that they should be considering, knowing that this is going to happen, and knowing that if they wait too long, there might be an inadvertent, burden upon them from a cost perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to plan for it, I think, because a lot of the time heating systems get replaced when they break down, and they usually break down when you've just used them quite a bit in the middle of winter, and also when you need them the most. And if you then are in an emergency situation, right, you're literally freezing in your home, you probably call your plumber, your heating system installer, or if you live in the US, you call the equivalent, right? But they will say, I can fix it. I can fix this for you. I just put it in another fossil system and it's going to be up and running on the same day. But if you want a heat pump, that's going to take weeks. And I can't install that. I don't advise you to do it. That's a common problem. So if you wait until it's too late, you probably then struggle to make the right choices because you're under so much time pressure. It's good to plan ahead. So if you know that your heating system is maybe nearing the end of its life, it's good to have a plan. It's good to be ready and maybe do an early replacement before you end up in an emergency situation. I think that's number one. I think number two is we know that there's not gonna be incentives around forever, right? For electrification. I mean, governments will, and they have in the past, offered incentives, but then phased them out as technology has matured and uptake has increased. So if you want to benefit from some of these programs, it's probably better to be there earlier on rather than sort of wait until the very end when they might actually be mandated, rather than being incentivized. They might become the new norm. That's maybe number two. And then I would also suggest that looking at just the long-term trajectory of where prices are headed, what it might cost you to actually operate the system. In a lot of countries, the economics are actually pointing towards electrification becoming more competitive. In some places already, it's much more competitive. In other places, it's moving in that direction. So I think taking a long-term view of what the cost might be, factoring in that gas prices might rise because of rising grid fees, commodity prices, and making sure that in your cost calculations, you're not just looking at the status quo, what's happening right now, but actually take a long-term view over 15 or 20 years.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the actions that policy and regulators should be taking, some of the ways that building owners and homeowners should be thinking about this. Let's talk about the third leg of the stool and the gas distribution companies themselves. What are your recommendations and insights for them as they start to consider what they should be doing as their business model starts to shift?
Yeah, let me start by saying what they should not be doing, and that is just to promote unrealistic technology pathways that involve large scale deployment of green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, biomethane. There's a role for using these gases. Don't get me wrong. There's a role for using these gases in other applications, but in the gas distribution system, I see very little scope for those gases and to compete for end users such as heating. I mean, I've done extensive research on, as you know, and you covered it in a previous episode, showing that the cost and efficiency of using hydrogen for heating is just very, very poor compared to some of the alternatives such as heat pumps or district heating systems. So I think gas grid companies should be looking at other alternatives that don't involve just a like-for-like replacement of one gas with another. There are clearly skills, right, that they are transferable. I mean, being able to build and operate large-scale connected infrastructure, dealing with lots of different customers, those skills can be needed in other areas too. Operating a district heating system, yes, it's different from the technology perspective, but that could be one pathway. And there might also be opportunities, and I think some of the gas companies are now going there to play more of a role, perhaps in a totally different infrastructure and roll out electrification technologies even. There's no reason why you could not invest in building a subsidiary that is involved in these kinds of activities. So diversification, I think, is the second strategy here if you want to sort of step out of the networked infrastructure. But I think it's still not happening. We're still seeing a lot of gas grid companies still thinking that is it somehow going to continue. They haven't really made that shift yet because it's very attractive for them. And I understand that if you have an asset, you want to keep using it. You just want to keep using it until the end of its lifetime, right? To maximize the profits. It makes complete sense. But it doesn't work from a climate perspective, and it doesn't work from an economic and customer perspective to just keep doing that. And I think it's really important to have an honest discussion about it and offer these companies a way out as well. And that's where, again, coming back to our previous points that we discussed. If you offer them a way out in terms of writing off assets early, that's one way of managing the transition. It doesn't mean that they're suddenly left with a huge cost that no one is going to pay for, but I think they have to start thinking about what alternative pathways they might exist in order to survive. But it's not going to be business as usual, that's for sure.
Yeah, so this might be an unfair question, but let's project forward to 2051. What does a gas distribution company from today look like in 2051?
Well, there will be a lot less need for gas distribution. I think there's a question to what extent are we still going to use gas distribution systems? We will probably still be using transmission systems, so large scale pipeline infrastructure, to transport feedstock for industry as a minimum. But there might also be a need for transporting other sort of gases for energy storage purposes and things like that. But at the distribution level, this is basically buildings, right? What we're talking about, individual buildings. I think there's a very limited role for gas distribution companies that's left. And that might be in areas, let's take an industrial cluster with a lot of hydrogen production, for example, right? Where you already have the local production of hydrogen. You have a transmission system that might be hydrogen based. Maybe there will be some role for gas distribution companies too, if there's a constrained power grid in that area, and there might be very certain conditions that have to be met for the economics to stack up. But I think it's going to be quite limited. So I wouldn't be banking on there to be lots of gas distribution companies in 2050.
Much more localized, much more individualized. There are 1,400 gas distribution companies here in the US alone, and I'm willing to bet that those are going to look very differently in 27 years or so. Jan, as we wrap up, what are the 2 or 3 things that you really want to make certain that the audience takes away from today's conversation?
Well, this is a super interesting but under-researched and under-discussed topic. Not many people have thought about it, and I have heard lots of different opinions on it, which I find curious. So, yes, it's sometimes people who are very much in favor of decarbonization will just say, "Oh, what's the problem if gas grid fees go up? People will just switch away from the gas grid. Yeah, they have even more incentive to do so." And equally, people who want to see business as usual happening say, "Oh, no, let's just wait and see what actually happens, and then deal with the problem later." I think both are deeply misguided, because if you don't address this head on, you create a big problem, either for the companies themselves and their business model, because they might suddenly find themselves with stranded assets, but also for the customers who have to pay for this. And it's not a good outcome. It's not a good outcome if we run into this huge kind of social, economic, political problem in a few years' time, which could cause significant disruption. And that's not something we should plan for. We should avoid it by smart regulation and make sure that we set the framework up in such a way that we have a managed transition that provides clarity, that gets us to where we need to get to, but do so in a way that is not harmful, especially to those households who might be on very low incomes and be struggling.
Agreed. There's a tsunami of change coming our way, and we need to approach it properly today in order to affect what's coming tomorrow. Jan Rosenow from Regulatory Assistance Project, thank you for joining us here on 8 Minutes. Really appreciate the conversation. I thought this was great.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.